Tonight, we learn about a retired special agent named Eduardo C. Alford, but I call him Eddie. In 2006, Eddie was promoted to the chief of the Counterterrorism Division's Domestic Terrorism Program. In 2008, Eddie was selected to head the Joint Terrorism Task Force in the FBI's Los Angeles field office. Eddie returned to the Counterterrorism Division in 2011 to become chief of the Strategic Operations Section. After more than 23 years of dedicated service to the FBI, my friend and tonight's special guest retired. Tonight, we learn more about Eddie's decorated career, the history of the FBI, and what he is doing with his group to train law enforcement professionals to have better relationships with African American communities. Thank you for coming to the Media and Society, Eddie. It's going to be a pleasure getting to talk about your career and your past and some history of the FBI. And looking forward to just sharing this next 45 minutes to an hour with you and go over some different questions that we have for you. We have Ken also as a moderator tonight, and he's looking forward to speaking with you just the same. So let's start by talking about the two African Americans that were trailblazers in the FBI, Sylvia and James Wormley. What do those two mean to you as a black FBI agent?
Well, to be quite honest, they really were the two trailblazers. I mean, a guy like me would have never had that opportunity had it not been for those two individuals. Obviously, Mr. Wormsley was the first African American, and then Matheson was the first black female. So they really paved the way for sisters and brothers like myself to even have the thought or the possibility of working for the FBI. Interesting.
How would you go about when you look back at what they did to the extent and to the point that they were able to do things? How involved do you think that James Wormley was when he got in there within his first 2 or 3 years?
That's actually a good question. And we've had myself and some friends and colleagues, we always speak about that. And we may delve into some of this later, but we just look at the challenges that we faced, that I faced personally over my last 25 years, but others who came on before me, even earlier in the late 70s and early 80s. And I can only imagine how hard and how difficult and how challenging it must have been to try to get this kind of work, this kind of job done. Because I look at how sometimes it's so hard and challenging and there's so many roadblocks even in today in the 21st century. So you go all the way back to when those trailblazers kind of paved the way for people of color to come into the FBI. I really don't even see how they were able to even get anything done, but they persevered. I'm sure they faced a lot of racism. I'm sure they faced not just inside the FBI, but think about what the country was like then. So I'm amazed that they were able to get even little things done back then. Because it's hard now.
Yeah. It's interesting because he came in during Hoover. So
exactly
that was really interesting when you think about the history of even Edgar Hoover, in general. And what I find very interesting about even just talking to you in this and have getting to know you over the years, you're one of the few people that has been in the doors of the J. Edgar Hoover building. One of the few blacks that have done that. And when you look across the spectrum of how many agents there are, there's about 614 collectively of African American agents, give or take. And you're one of that 4.5%, 4.6% of the special agents that were African American out of the 19,000 agents that there are totally. There's only about 600. So I mean, how does that really make you feel like you've achieved that? Because that's huge, and I think to our audience, they'd probably want to hear how did that make you feel over these last 23 years or whatever.
So the one thing about the FBI that is has the mystique on it is just it's so um, people when you hear FBI, people pay attention, and that even translates outside of the United States. So that those three letters, man, FBI really resonate. And obviously there are some things that they need to improve on, but really the FBI really is the premier law enforcement agency in the world. And what I mean by that is we had discussions, we talk all the time about things, of that nature, but regardless of what the press might be saying negative about the FBI, anywhere in the world, if something bad happens, people typically don't get comfortable until the FBI shows up. So that really speaks to really what is the backbone of the FBI, and it's the agents and the professional support staff. It really is about the people. Now, obviously, recently it's been a little bit more politicized than it typically has been in the past. But I tell you, Anthony, that when bad things happen, people get more comfortable or they feel better about something being done when the FBI shows up.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay, let's delve into your career, and let's talk. Tell us about your career. How did you even get to the FBI? What was your start in law enforcement?
So I'll be bluntly honest. I should say I never ever thought about the FBI when I was growing up, and even through my educational track. I mean, the FBI was not on my radar screen, to be quite honest. But I did have a little bit of interest in law enforcement, and the reason I knew I had an interest because I always played cops and robbers when I was a little kid. Me and my friends in the neighborhood, we were always cops and robbers. But I was always a cop. I was never a robber. So in my mind, I always thought about something like that, but I never really thought that I would be doing law enforcement because back then, growing up in the mid '60s and the '70s, and I grew up in North Carolina, so the Ku Klux Klan was really big in my area. I mean, we had a annual event, and they would actually march in full garments, their robes and everything, every year. So those types of things were in my face. So I never really thought that I would gravitate to a career in law enforcement. But the interesting thing is, and I got this from my mom and my dad, I always saw my mom and dad, even in those trying times in the '60s and the '70s as I was a young boy. They were always, and we trust me when I say we were not rich by any stretch of the imagination. Probably lower middle class. My mom was a factory worker, and my dad was a long distance truck driver. So they were a two income household, but we didn't have a lot. But I saw my mom and dad always extending a hand to help people. So I wasn't sure what I was going to do in life, but I had a passion for doing something that was going to help people. So I knew I didn't want to be a doctor because I was afraid of needles. So it's just ironic that I kind of gravitated to the FBI because my mom, in one of her side jobs, she had a side hustle. She would babysit, you know, kids. One of her kids was a gentleman. His name is David Dunn, white guy from my area. So when I was a senior in high school, I was a senior class president, and we were having a career day. I saw him walking up the steps to the school, and he had this bunch of material in his hands, and he dropped some of them. So since I knew him, I walked out of the school to help him pick up his stuff. Well, when I saw the items that he had, it had three letters on the items on the pamphlets. It had SBI. So I was like, SBI. So I said, Mr. Dunn, what does SBI stand for? He said, "Hey, come by my booth, and I'll tell you about it." So technically, the agency that he'd worked for, and I didn't even know, was an agency in North Carolina called North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Now, most people know now, although I didn't know then, but Georgia has GBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Tennessee has TBI. So that was a state law enforcement agency that worked for the Attorney General or reported to the Attorney General. And it was not a uniform law enforcement work, but it was plain clothes. And I thought that was very interesting. Now, when I graduated from college, my very first job, I was a police officer in Northern Virginia, in Prince William County, as a matter of fact, Anthony, our county. So I was a cop in Prince William County, and then the SBI called me about almost 2 years later and offered me a position. So I went back and got my first taste of working plain clothes law enforcement, or being a special agent, being an investigator. And it really, in my mind, was the best job I thought in the world, to be honest. I was helping the sheriff's departments and the police departments, and we did a variety of things. Arsons, we did marijuana eradication. I worked undercover. So I was fat, dumb, and happy, so to speak, because I was in North Carolina. I was 45 minutes away from home. I still had a chance to see all my friends that I grew up with. So I was living large until I ran into a DEA agent who worked on a federal task force. And he and I became friends, and he talked about the differences of the system that he was in, the federal system, and the state system that I was in. And the main thing that stuck in my mind was the retirement. Mm. Their retirement was much, much better. So a friend of mine convinced me to apply for the FBI. I really never thought that I would, get selected, but I kept passing the test and all the other things, the steps that I had to do. It took almost, not quite 2 years, but almost 2 years. And then I can tell you that and this is a little bit personal, y'all. This might be a little bit more than you want to know, but when I got my letter of appointment from the FBI, I was dating a young lady at the time who was an assistant district attorney in North Carolina. And at that time, I thought I was all in love, and I was never going to leave North Carolina. I mean, I had the perfect lady and the perfect job. And she and I were out to dinner, and I showed her this letter, and I told her that, hey, I'm not going to accept this. I love what I'm doing now. And, life couldn't be better. And she told me, she said, you are crazy.
Wow.
Do you understand how important this is? If you turn this job down, you might miss out on expanding the boundaries of your life. Why not take this opportunity and go beyond North Carolina? And I knew at the time that meant that our relationship was going to end. But I don't think if I hadn't had that conversation with her, and if she would have said to me, no, you can't leave me. You better not take this position, I would have torn that letter up, and I would have never joined the FBI. And I thought about her. She unfortunately had developed liver cancer about a year and a half ago and died. And I drove back down to Wilmington, North Carolina for her funeral. And all the way down there, I thought about all the things that I had done in my FBI career, to include retiring and doing some other things that I do now. But that would have never happened. This career that I had would have never happened had it not been for that young lady encouraging me to step outside of my what I thought were my boundaries, and look to do something greater than what I was already doing. And she was absolutely right.
Wow. That's incredible. I'm very sorry for your loss. But you were that close to not even taking the position. But without that conversation, you wouldn't have decided then and there to even go for the FBI, right?
No, I would have told, if she'd have said, sweetheart, you can't leave me, I would have said, you're absolutely right, I can't. And I would have torn that letter up. And that means also, Anthony, you and I would have never met.
This is true. So, what is the day in the life of an agent? So not from the perspective of your management side, but when you first got in, what is it like for a new agent? What are you doing?
Honestly, it's pretty exciting. And think about, Anthony, when I joined the FBI in the early 90s, 1992, there was a lot of street crimes, a lot of stuff happening, violent crime. And that was really one of the reasons why I was heavily recruited, because before then, the FBI was known more for being a white collar agency,
Mm-hmm.
you know, financial fraud, bank robbery, banking stuff, right? But there was such an explosion of violent crime that the government decided, hey, we got to get some additional resources out on the streets. So then this thing called the Safe Streets Initiative was launched by the federal government, and it mainly was managed by the FBI. But what happened is they put FBI agents, got them out of the offices, and they co-located them with the police departments and sheriff's departments, so we could really start to tackle the violence that was going on across America. I mean, it was in small town America. It was in the big cities, the inner cities. It was everywhere. So for a guy like me, who was already working in that environment, it was just a good segue for me, because I was able to come into the FBI. And I think my first 3 or 4 years in the FBI, I never put a suit on. I was in blue jeans and street clothes, and I was loving life, because not only was I
comfortable.
Oh my gosh, not only was I doing something that I was very comfortable with, but I was making more money while I was doing it. Now, I I was assigned to Pittsburgh, but that's not. I almost quit. I mean, literally, I got to share this. So, what they do for FBI agents at the end of your training, they hand out randomly your assignment, or like where you're going to be assigned. Before that, you get to list all the states on a map, and you put your preference where you'd like to be, first. Obviously, I put Charlotte. I put Charlotte, North Carolina. But everybody and their grandma wants to go to Charlotte. So out of that list of all the cities in the United States, they decide where you're going to go. So that's the thing that I think bothered me, or worried me, I should say, the most, because I just wasn't sure where I was going to go. Mm-hmm. And I'd never really been I'd been outside of North Carolina, with my dad on his truck, but not to live away from my family. So I was the only African American in my class. Hmm. And then I had a name Eduardo, which was Spanish.
Yeah.
Which is another funny story. Because my mom nor my dad named me. My mom's sister named me Eduardo. So people thought initially, when they didn't see me, that I was Hispanic, but I'm not. So here I am, an African American. We got 50 people in this class, and the only person of color was me.
Wow.
But so when I got my assignment, it said Pittsburgh, and right up under Pittsburgh, it said Clarksburg. And I was like, well, okay, I'm assuming that that's got something to do with Pittsburgh. Now I was familiar with Pittsburgh because my dad trucked a lot of steel in and out of Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. So I'd been to Pittsburgh. I was kind of familiar with the area a little bit. Not some place that I would have said, oh, please send me to Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. But I knew I had signed up to go wherever they said it was the needs of the Bureau. So so somebody said, hey, Eddie, do you know where Clarksburg is? And I said, no, I'd never heard of it, but I'm assuming it has something to do with Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And they said, no, not really. They said, Clarksburg is in West Virginia.
Oh, man.
When I heard West Virginia, I was like, you could have bought for a penny. My face was like, I was like, you mean to tell me they send a guy like me to I said West by God, Virginia, but I said West Virginia. And I was so horror struck that was on Friday night. Saturday morning, I had my roommate and the other two guys in the room that joined ours. Four of us shared a suite, two in one side and two on the other side. The three of those guys, and one was Mexican, and the other two guys were Cubans from Miami, and me. And we drove from Quantico, Virginia to Morgantown, West Virginia.
That's a haul.
And when I tell you guys, it was like the movie Deliverance. I was like, you got to be kidding me. I mean, I was blown away. I was like, and all the way back home, I even called my mom, said, I'm going to quit. I'm going to resign. And she was like, you sure you're going to do that? I said, Mom, I can't do West Virginia. I can't do it. I can't do it.
Having lived in West Virginia, I understand.
Hey,
but
my
I
son
gotta
lives there
tell
now.
You, I got to tell you that obviously I didn't quit. I gave it a chance. And I can tell you that although there were things that were limited for African Americans back in the early 90s, like there was no, barbers for African Americans. I had to go to a place called Uniontown, Pennsylvania. And then ultimately I had to go all the way up to Pittsburgh. But the people were very friendly. And what I was doing there, the FBI was moving a big part of their support division out to Clarksburg, West Virginia. And so I was going there to do background investigations for the men and women in West Virginia to get jobs. So it was a good mission, and people were obviously, glad that this was coming because it was going to increase, the income in that region. With people coming in, businesses. So I was a welcome sight. But I had a guy tell me, I interviewed a guy way deep down into West Virginia. It was about 2 hours south of Morgantown. And
Davis?
He was friendly. He was a former FBI employee that worked for J. Edgar Hoover. So his daughter was applying for a job. And he told me, he said, the people here are friendly. Just make sure that you're out of town before it gets dark. And I said, I promise you, when I leave your house, I'm going straight back to Morgantown. but I was in West Virginia about 8 months, and then they moved me up to Pittsburgh, to where it was a little bit more urban and a little bit more conducive to things that I had done, prior to coming to the FBI. So it really was not a bad experience. But I think growing up in North Carolina, at the time that I grew up in North Carolina, prepared me for that 8 or 9 months that I spent in West Virginia. But really, to be quite honest, I was not called any negative words. I'll get to that part. I was called an N-word in one of the cities that I would have said, they calling me the N-word in this city? But we'll get to that.
Yeah. So here's a question. So how do you feel like you would garner respect? How did you go about garnering the respect of your peers that were your white peers throughout your career?
I fortunately walked into the FBI with law enforcement experience. So I'd already dealt with protecting and serving in some sense, a little bit different from what the normal FBI agent had already been doing before I came on board. So I knew how to conversate, talk to people, meet people where they were as far as bad situations. So I was pretty good at calming those things down and seeing it from their side, but also being able to enforce the law. So having a guy like me walk in there, I had almost, I wouldn't say instantaneous respect, because I think some of my colleagues kind of wanted to stand back and wait to see, but I was a hands-on kind of guy, and I got that from my parents.
Okay.
Plus, I mean, y'all may laugh, but I know FBI agents right now who have been FBI agents 25 to 30 years, and they have never put anybody in jail, never used their handcuffs, never done a prosecutor's report. But that's just how the FBI is. And it depends on what you do, particularly if you work counterterrorism and counterintelligence. Those types of cases don't typically lead to arrest. I mean, because it's intel. Yeah. Right. It's more behind the scenes. It's more top secret compartmented kind of things. Those are the types of cases where people get put on airplanes and they disappear. So I was a guy that had already I was very skilled at getting people arrested. I'd done a lot of testifying in court at the local and state level. So I kind of came into the FBI with a level of skill that was probably above 65-70% of the agents that were already on board.
Mm-hmm.
So people kind of gravitated to me because I knew how to do things. I didn't have to ask questions about, hey, how to write this search warrant or how to put together this prosecutive report,
Mm-hmm.
because I had done those things at the state level. So I was pretty skilled at it. Now, what was different, that the funny thing for a guy like me, in the state system, you work your cases, then you take it to the DA's office, right?
Mm.
In the federal system, that's not the way it's done.
Mm.
You go to the U.S. Attorney's office first. They tell you what to do and how to do it, and then you go out and make the case. So I had to get pulled back. So I got a couple of talks, because they told me, said, Eddie, that's not how we do it in the federal level. So once I made that adjustment and realized that I had to involve the U.S. Attorney's Office from the outset,
Mm-hmm.
because I was accustomed to making my own cases and then going to the district attorney. The federal system is very different.
Mm-hmm.
The federal system is better. And the reason the federal system has such a good record of not losing cases is because of the way they work cases.
Mm-hmm.
When you have your attorneys involved at the beginning of your cases, then you don't make as many mistakes. So I realized that was an asset, not a detriment.
Gotcha. Wow. So I mean that moves us into the next part of this in talking about like civil rights and you as a federal agent. So what are some things that can be done to give accurate accounts within investigations when involving African Americans? Now, the reason I asked that is because I was watching a 60 Minutes report with some FBI, some agents, some retired agents. And what they were saying on that is that even the case like with Breonna Taylor, they don't have any black agents investigating. It's all white agents. So isn't there something, don't you feel like they should have some African American agents on a case like that, being that you're going to have some kind of fairness? I mean, we're already seeing a lot of unfairness with just the local police.
There's no right specific answer, but I'll 1992, which is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
That's another story. But you're right. Typically, it would be better to have people or agents of color work and be involved in those types of investigations. And the reason is because that gives you a connection to the community, regardless of what people may say or may not say. There are some African Americans who don't want to deal with white law enforcement, whether it be FBI or the local police department or either a sheriff's department. They don't want to deal with it because there is an element of mistrust.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have an African American, male or female, who is entrenched in the community but can at least go to, for example, I used to always go to some of the churches, like all the cities that I lived and worked in. I would go to the churches, some of the black churches, and introduce myself. I didn't attend all the time, but sometimes they would ask me to come in and do speeches or do talks and things, and it really helped them understand a little bit more about what the role is of the FBI, because most of them honestly didn't really know.
Mm-hmm.
Because their interaction, they might have interacted with some federal agents, but they did it in conjunction with either the state or locals.
Yeah.
So when you take away, you start talking about civil rights investigations and color of law and things like that, because the FBI is charged with policing the police, right?
Yeah.
So in order for you to be able to do that, your workforce really has to be diverse. And I think that's where some of the FBI field officers, and I can take the Minneapolis and Milwaukee, those two cities as a recent example.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have a lot of African American agents in those two field offices.
Mm.
So, but that was an excellent question, Anthony. Those types of dynamics have to change.
Now, how can we obtain more diversity in the field and in law enforcement? And are there ample opportunities for that diversity to happen?
Oh no, there are. And to be honest, it should be more of a national approach,
Mm-hmm.
but the FBI is so big, like a field office has really their own little small program, which is a subset of the big national program, right? But that program is only going to be as good as the people that run it.
Right.
And the people that run those believe that there are good candidates out there. And it really takes a lot of effort. And I'm not the kind of guy that'll point the finger,
Right.
but there are good candidates there. There are good African American candidates out there. You have to go to the schools, and really, what I was championing back when I was in the FBI was you have to start early. Don't wait till these young men and women get to college. Start hitting these kids in the 7th and 8th grade. Now, that's way too soon, right? But what it does is, because I never even knew about the FBI until I was actually I didn't know about the FBI until I was graduating from high school. So when you wait that long and you've already kind of decided about what college you're going to go to, what curriculum, what degree you might study, and back when I came on, what degree you studied didn't necessarily it mattered, but it didn't matter as much as it does now,
Right.
because
That's
now the
specialization.
FBI has really gotten very specific about what they're looking for, rightfully so. There's nothing wrong with that. There's still excellent candidates out there, but when I came on board, they they had a diversified program, which meant that you could have any degree, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you could come into the FBI as long as you had the requisite work experience. So, but I think they got to start early. I think 7th to 8th grade, but certainly as they walk into high school, the FBI's got to go be there at the career days, start talking to them about other opportunities, because there are other ways. The FBI special agent process is a lot more difficult than the professional support.
Mm-hmm.
And those positions are excellent as well. They don't carry guns, but they make the same amount of money in some instances. They travel around the world just like the agents do, and it really is a great career. And when you are inside of the FBI, that's an easy segue into becoming an agent.
Mm.
So
Interesting. Okay. So, how do we get society, communities of color, even, let's say, even white communities, because they have a lot of issues with law enforcement too, where they don't even like some law enforcement. So, how do you go about healing and building trust between law enforcement and just any community?
well, to be honest, Anthony, it starts with building relationships. And I'm engaged in some of that kind of work now, where I volunteer, with some friends of mine who we do work with the FBI in some way to help build these bridges
Mm-hmm.
and build these relationships in these communities. And we talk to police departments about things that they can do strategically, to help change this misnomer that's out there that everybody don't trust the police. Now, are there things that are transpiring that really festers that mistrust? Absolutely. But they got to get better at building relationships, building bridges, and it starts by engaging the community.
Mm-hmm.
And I even had a friend of mine that works in a city that I won't name, but he's the chief of police. And when he says that he's engaging the community, he even engages the criminal element of his community as well. Those people that are running those gangs,
Interesting.
those people that are out there on the edge. When he brings people together, he brings them also, because that honestly is the key. If you can reach the criminal element and build some trust there, start building a bridge there. Now, that doesn't mean you allow them to be criminals.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously you want that to not continue, but when you can have contacts in that part of your community, it makes protecting and serving that community a lot easier.
Well, I want to thank you so much for definitely taking some time and speaking with us. I do have one last question. When you look back across your entire career and all that you've done, what do you hope to pass on to younger generations?
Anthony, that's a great question. And I have uh, two sons myself, one that might be interested in law enforcement, and then I coached a lot of young men, in some of the cities that I lived in, in my career, I was always coaching basketball and baseball and talking at some of the schools. And, I think I would say to those young men and women who might be interested in law enforcement that it's when you come into a job like this, if you think about it early and start preparing yourself. Some of the things, Anthony, some of the pitfalls that I was able to work around, so I was able to get through a background check, as far as, credit, driving records, things like that. I just did it just because of how I was raised, right? So those are some of the things that I always talk to some of these young kids about is keep your driving records good because, you'll have cars that you'll be assigned to drive. Keep your credit good, pay your bills on time, do those things because you'll have a top secret security clearance. And, it's based on your ability to be financially stable and, be very conscientious about peer pressure and hanging out and doing things because you just never know what type of job that you might look to aspire to attain where you might have to go through a background check. And there are a lot of companies that do background checks now, not just the FBI. So, and I would say have passion for, if you're a kind of person that you want to help people, it's a good job. It's a great career. I traveled all over the world. And you really, no one day, Anthony, that I can think of was the same in my entire career. I think every single day was different, and that's very unusual. So it's a good job. You help people, and you work with a team of people who are like minded. I always say this, and this is good. We can end on this. People that gravitate to a job like the FBI, 9 out of 10 FBI agents, if you ask them questions all around the world, they are always the kind of people that run to a problem. If something bad happens, they are always going towards it, where most people are going away from it. So if you're that kind of person and you are the type that will run to a problem instead of running away from it, or I had a friend of mine say, I stop on the highway. If I see an accident that happens right in front of me, I always pull over and get out. And a lot of people just drive around those things. So most FBI agents have those types of qualities. They sometimes are A personalities, but they are the type of men and women that want to help people. So,
okay, thank you so much for coming on the Media and Society, and I want to thank everyone for tuning into this episode. Remember, you can keep the conversation going and see us on Facebook, on Twitter, and YouTube. Don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Ken, or our producer, Austin. And we look forward to seeing you on another episode of the Media and Society.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.